5분 동안.
Did you enjoy your break? So we are resuming our session. We have 4 presenters and we have 2 panelists for this session. Let me introduce them. From the Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries, we have Mr. Jin Sung-jun. We were going to have Mr. Oh Young-nok, but he had to go to the National Assembly to attend to his business. So we have Mr. Jin Sung-jun instead. Next, we have a renowned professor, Professor Woo Soo-han of Chung-Ang University, from the Department of International Logistics at Chung-Ang University. And Professor Woo Soo-han worked for Ministry of Fisheries of Korea for 12 years, so he is well versed in fisheries policies and so on. So this is how we are going to do this panel discussion. We already listened to the presentations, and Professor Woo Soo-han didn't give a presentation, so why don't we give him 5 minutes for his talk. So maybe he can share with us what he's been thinking about this particular issue. And then I'm going to throw out some questions for our presenters and panelists. And then maybe we can take 1 or 2 questions from the floor. And before we close, we can give some time to Mr. Jin to close the session. So first, Professor Woo, the floor is yours. And any comments or your insight? So regarding the current state and the future direction of shipping and ports. Good morning, I'm Woo Soo-han.
Sam Jo. Yeah. And thank you very much for your time. I believe you. It's very early in the morning, like 2 a.m. in UK, and but it's very pleased to meet you in here. And I need to excuse myself for using Korean language because I'm Korean and then I'm better at Korean. So 감사합니다.
Thank you, Professor Smith and Commissioner Sam Cho. In various meetings, I met with them, and recently, regarding this crucial issue of decarbonization, I had chances to sit down with them and talk about it. So that's why I wanted to have them. And I know that it's an early hour, but they joined us for their presentations. So thank you very much. And along with Chair Professor Kim, we were preparing for this session, and we wanted to talk about automation, decarbonization, and interruption of supply chain management, geopolitical changes that happened in recent years, and how all these affected supply chains across the world. So that's what we wanted to talk about for this session. So I'll be sharing with you some of my thoughts, and I'll be asking questions as well.
네, 우리 트리스탄 스미스 교수님은 여러분 보시면 아시겠지만 가장 최근에 MEPC 80차에서 일어났던 결정들을 기반으로 해서 그 내용을 서머리해 주시고 또 그것에 기반해서 우리 해운 산업이나 조선 산업이 어떻게 대응하면 좋겠는지를 말씀해 주셨고요. 굉장히 감사했습니다. 제가 이제 가장 느끼는 것은 그러한 급격한 변화들이 우리 이제 해운 산업이나 조선 산업에 미치는 영향이 굉장히 강하고 그렇게 했을 때 각 국에서 어떻게 대응해야 되는지 이런 부분들이 굉장히 고민스러운 부분이 많습니다. 특히 기업들
to answer for companies. Incentives to first movers is quite sizable. So those first movers with the enough capital are very proactive. But for those in the mid to lower tier in the industry, these companies are at a loss of where to go. So I do see a polarization in the industry. For governments, there are support for eco-friendly movements, but this is an IMO regulation and companies will respond to that. Governments don't really know what their role is and what support they can provide. And they're not sure what would be enough. So the question I grapple with is the IMO measures in reaching net zero by 2050. How effective would these IMO measures be? What are the most effective mechanisms? Because these would be the biggest challenge at hand. And when we do see a clear mechanism to adopt, then companies will respond accordingly and government will have a better and clearer way to provide support for the companies. So in that sense, to Professor Smith, my question is, declaring net zero and the targets from 2030, 2040 from IMO and the market-based measures will be also implemented going forward. And in your view, how much of a contribution will these measures make in achieving net zero? And in the process, what kind of efforts are needed for individual governments? So if you can share your thoughts on that, I would appreciate it.
저 샘조 그
For Commissioner Sam Cho, well, I would also like to basically the same question for him as well. So along with these regulations by the IMO, at an individual state level, well, countries are taking measures and actions to meet the regulations. So the IMO presents guidelines and measures. And between Korea and the US, we are pursuing this green shipping corridors, which is quite meaningful. So that's why I wanted to have you for this session. So for Commissioner Sam Cho, my quick question is, in this particular route, well, when we pursue this green shipping corridor in the short term, the costs will rise because OPEX is going to go up, CAPEX is going to go up as well. So along this route, doesn't that actually undermine competitiveness of this route? So in order to save costs, don't you think that clients will choose to use detours and another route due to cost issues? So in order to be economically competitive from the perspective of BPA or the government, what kind of actions or measures can we take?
그 이제 서정기 대표님
And next to Mr. Seo, you mentioned the full automated terminal that just opened up in Busan Port 2.0, 2.5. Thank you so much for your contribution, and this means a lot. And near the end of your presentation, you mentioned that the final step of automation will be a smart technology, and towards that end, you are using AI and other smart technologies. But could you elaborate on that? How can intellectual smart systems will be used by your company going forward?
우리
And for Mr. Masami of Nippon Express Korea, what I was interested in your presentation was, well, about the supply chain management and how it was disrupted during the time of the pandemic. Well, we saw the disruption, and now they're back on track, and we're seeing more logistics companies starting their business in this field. So, about this supply chain management, we now know we have higher awareness regarding how this SCM can play a crucial role, and also how controlling the SCM during the time of crisis can be crucial. So as you are doing business in logistics, when we have a disruption like the coronavirus, well, it affected the freight rates, of course, but when it comes to production and supply, did it really affect supply and production? And in order to increase control of supply chains, well, is there any other geopolitical issue or geopolitical factor that affects this point? Thank you. Yes, Professor Wu gave us kind of a summary of 4 presentations, and he also threw out some questions. Commissioner Sam Cho is not with us, so it's only questions for the 3 presenters.
Tristan, would you like to answer those questions?
Thank you. I hope the audio is okay. So thank you very much for the questions, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this meeting. As I said before, it's a great pleasure to be with you and to be part of this conversation. Having these exchanges internationally across different parts of the world is critical as the sector considers how it's going to decarbonize. So the questions, as I understood them, were how much will the midterm measures that the IMO adopts drive decarbonization, and what should be the efforts by national governments? So I will start with the first one. The contribution of IMO regulation can be very powerful. We have good historical examples of how, for example, the sulfur regulations or the double hull tanker regulation, once they are put in place and they have a strong enforcement mechanism, can be effective at creating the business case for investment. And that's because they require compliance for enabling ships to operate under port state control. So if ships are not in compliance, if the sanctions are very significant, i.e. potentially a large fine or arresting the vessel, then that creates the business case for using a technology or another solution that ensures that the regulation has been met. Now, we do not have the regulatory detail. We don't have the legislative detail of the measures at this point. It's under development, will be agreed and adopted in 2025. So we can only speculate about what the midterm measures will likely to be. And in our opinion, it's the combination of the greenhouse gas pricing with the fuel standard that create the effectiveness that the sector will need for those IMO regulations to drive a large part of the investment that the sector needs in both the fuel supply chain, but also in the fleet. And the combination is effective because the transition that we're going through now does not have a fully mature or fully developed set of technologies. We will need to have significant effort in this decade into the research, design, development and deployment of some of the zero emission fuel solutions, so that they reach a level of maturity that can enable their mass market scaling as we go into the 2030s. And the greenhouse gas pricing, not necessarily at a very high level, but a level that creates revenues, and the redeployment of those revenues can be very useful in stimulating RD&D, research, development and deployment of zero emission technologies in this coming decade. So it's not a mandate on the fleet to adopt hydrogen derived fuels. It's an incentive for those who want to be early adopters. It's a subsidy for the energy supply chain development that we need in order to make sure that those supply chains are ready for when a mandate, which is typically how one can think of the greenhouse gas fuel standard, the kind of regulatory requirement that a ship consumes a fuel with a certain specification, in this case, a reduction in the greenhouse gas intensity of the fuel, that mandate drives the mass market adoption, because it's then a matter of compliance to use a fuel with a certain specification. And the best parallel for that is the sulfur regulation. The reason why that regulation was successful is because it's very clear that you would need to operate with a lower sulfur content fuel from January the 1st, 2020, or achieve compliance with an alternative mechanism. And that is how we imagine the fuel standard is going to look and drive both the fleet's transition, but crucially, the fuel standard creates the certainty for the fuel producers, because it tells the fuel producers that there will be demands for their fuels in certain volumes over the next 15, 20 years, and that enables the investment that creates that supply. So I think with the outcome of the revised strategy from the IMO, which is so strong and is clearly stating a very strong ambition, the likelihood that the IMO drives the transition significantly has increased, and that's a good thing for a sector like shipping that we think has the least cost transition if it's driven by global regulation rather than by national action. But that doesn't mean that you don't have a role for national governments, and there are some really important steps that they can take, especially in the period until 27, 28, when the IMO regulatory solution has entered into force. But also to enable the wider ecosystem changes that are needed. So, for example, we will need a lot of development of safety regulation for new fuels, which have different challenges to the fossil fuels we use today. Ammonia, hydrogen, methanol all contain slightly different risks, and the way that we store those locally, the way that we bunker the fuels, the way that crews need to operate in order to be safe, will all need to be developed. And that's something that national governments can be assisting during this period in trials and pilots and local deployments before the regulation scales their use in the global fleet. We'll also need to do work on our ports and our infrastructure, which is all within the jurisdiction of national government. So the way that those ports develop the bunkering infrastructure, the way that they retrain their personnel is something that is all within that scope of action. And then obviously the energy supply chain. So depending on the country and its potential to be a producer of new energy commodities, there's a need for national governments to start their hydrogen and energy strategies now that build up the supply of these new fuels that shipping will need, and to identify how they will target and access the shipping sector's use of their fuel. So, for example, a country like Australia or Chile or Namibia are all examples of countries that have got huge potential to be very low-cost producers of green hydrogen, and therefore green hydrogen-derived fuels like ammonia. And their hydrogen strategies and the actions they take in this interim period will be critical for enabling those fuels to be scaling up to be available as IMO regulates for that to be a mandated requirement. And I would say that the final role of that national government is to look at that period of time that we now have and to see how they can support shipping in bridging the period until 27. So the next 3 or 4 years is a critical window for national governments. We've seen an announcement from the United States, for example, on green hydrogen hubs that was referred to in another presentation. But within that, they are including $1 billion of support from the demand side. That is subsidy for operators who want to use a green hydrogen or a blue hydrogen fuel, and it's a support for the operators of that, not just capital grants into the supply of fuels, but also operational support for the demand side. And I think that will be critical, examples such as the US, but other countries, in order to ensure that we have some of the early use that will dovetail onto the use stimulated by IMO regulation as it comes into play later in the decade. I hope that's answered the question.
Tristan Smith.
Thank you, Professor Tristan Smith.
Accepting our invitation to this the forum. Thank you so much. Your excellent and informative speech. Thank you so much. 자, 다음 그러면 예.
Yes, I think next is Mr. Kim. Is this on? Yes. in automation, adoption of smart technologies. Well, when you think of automation, and I've always been involved in the automation of technologies from early on. In reverse, automation means that the same routine jobs that were previously done manually will be done by machines. So AGVs in ports and terminals are short for automated guided vehicles. So automated equipment, automated vehicles that can do repetitive work. Autonomous operation and smart ports is the buzzword. Smart ports is a big word. What's the definition of smart? So placing a smart person and making him do the same work over and over again, and he does it very well, and he's been doing it for 20 years, for instance. And we're now thinking maybe we can make the work smarter. And that's what we're looking at for smart ports, automating repetitive work and then moving forward to do the work more smartly and autonomously. But smart requires a lot of information. Only knowing what you have always done is not enough. And I mentioned the AGVs earlier. We have their predefined routes, and AGVs just repeat going back and forth on those routes. But in the case of emergency, to prevent collision or if there's a sudden change of work, in these sudden changes, how efficiently and smartly can these environments be adjusted? So that is where we're going with smart autonomous operations in ports. That's a natural change that is happening. And then also, I said that these technologies are getting smarter and more autonomous. Then what will the operators do then? The operators, particularly the younger workers, are much more smart nowadays, and they don't work for ports or terminals anymore. Because port work involves 24/7 work, and no one wants to do that, and you have to work without weekends. So in the end, we're going from automation to autonomous operations and smarter ports. So ports will become man-less completely. That's the only way forward. Thank you.
In the interest of time, I don't think I'm going to repeat. And please, Mr. Masami.
Questions. So my understanding is mainly two questions. So one is for ocean trade terms, so after the COVID-19. Secondly, so US-China trades. 日本語괜찮아よということだったので、ちょっと so there seem to be a little bit of sensitive issues. So I'd like to reply to you. So in Japanese, I'm sorry. 一つ目のオーシャン
First, about the oceans market, what I can tell you is during the time of the pandemic, all the clients, suppliers, and consumers, well, if you think about what they did during the time of the pandemic, they increased their stocks. So what's happening now is we see an overstock of products. And these are non-performing stocks. So that is actually interrupting supply chains, and that led to a financial disaster that is dampening consumption. And we have so much stock that has been piling up. And after the pandemic, if consumption recovers, then that would be good. But you know that consumption didn't really catch up. So we can see that the supply chain is still moving very slowly. So when it comes to the oceans market and ocean cargo market, it's moving very slowly. And the future trend is kind of related to the next question. The ocean cargo market, well, it is going to recover. And like I said, we will see more vessels that is built, and we will see more supply. in the vessels market. So I believe that there is some clearing out of the market going forward. So depending what happens in this market, we are ready to pay keen attention to this. And between the US and China, we see these trade conflicts between the two countries. And when it comes to semiconductors, for Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, these are the major players for semiconductors, and they are leading the semiconductor markets across the world. And especially in the US, semiconductor factories will see increased investments in the US. So the suppliers, which are Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, like I said. So if you think about the trade between Korea and China, well, the trade for China, which is standing at 30%, is actually decreasing, and that is switching to the US. And I believe that trend will strengthen. And just like Japan and Taiwan, Korea as well is in a difficult position in terms of geopolitics. So the semiconductor market after 2024 will be led by Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. Production, consumption will pick up going forward.
이제 55분인데 5분 정도 남았는데 제가 우리 그
Listening to what I was hearing, well, there is some clarification I need before I take questions from the floor. From Mr. Masami's point, well, dual license was mentioned in your presentation. So how dual license can be utilized so that we can transport from Korea to Japan? And also you mentioned the free trade zone. Can you elaborate on the free trade zone as well?
日本と韓国は、日本
Japan and Korean governments, the Ministry of Transportation of Japan and Korea signed a sort of a contract regarding the terms of conditions for transportation. I called it a double license trucking. And in each country, they have this truck license in each country, and using a dual license, they can freely move around into countries. So when it means that we can shorten time to take for loading and unloading of cargo, and we do not need human resources. And it also guarantees safe transportation. So it's a very innovative way of transportation. So both of the governments are willing to expand such cargo cooperation using double licensing of trucking. And as a logistics company, we are willing to provide such a service. Thank you. With Professor Wu and Mr. Chin, I have questions for them. Well, we have experts of the field of high technology, and between the Port of Seattle and Port of Busan, we are talking about these green corridors, and we are talking about companies with top-notch capital and technology. And Nippon Express is also the case in point. But when it comes to digitalization and decarbonization, this is not something top-notch shipping companies can only do, but we need other players as well. So it can be small vessels, ship-going vessels, and vessels that go to Northeast Asian countries. It doesn't have to be very big with high-tech. So all the players have to work together to pursue net zero. So for Professor Wu and Mr. Chin, Well, it's not like we are looking at container ships first and small ships later, but this is not something that can fully addressed by the regulations of the IMO. So if you think about the order or the best way to do this, how to approach it, well, if you can share with us your input, please keep it brief. Thank you.
우선
Yes, let me go first. Before I share my thoughts, I want to say to Tristan. Tristan, are you there?
exactly wanted to listen to. So thank you for your answer to my question. 네. 네. 방금 김인현 교수님께서 질문하신 부분 제가 말씀을
So to answer your question, Professor Kim, IMO regulates international shipping. And for coastal ships or fishing vessels, the IMO does not have jurisdiction over that. They fall under the jurisdiction of each nation based on the Paris Agreement, NDCs. These vessels will be applied with separate sets of regulations by each nation. So NDC allows for carbon ETS, emission trading system, and to gradually reduce the emitting fuels. IMO, on the other hand, oversees international shipping. So how the ships that ocean-going ships that sail through high seas. So these are very strict sets of regulations. Yes, first movers with lots of capital and well-advanced technologies are much more better equipped to respond. And the midterm measures by the IMO also provides bigger incentives for those who do better. That is the basic structure. So in that sense, what is the role of each government? Well, the government has to play a very important role because this regulation is by an international organization. The governments cannot just stand by and think that the companies will do well on their own. And this is a task for all of us. We need to be more proactive. I hope that governments would move more proactively. The Korean government in particular, the Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries, and the Ministry of Economy and Finance that provides the budget support, and the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy are doing hard work. And they do provide support, but I think that more practical, more leading, more bigger, dominant support is what is needed. If you look at the direction of where IMO is going with their measures and regulations, I think that the Korean government measures are relatively timid and not sufficient. I hope that the eco-friendly ship support is provided by MOF, and that is about 10% subsidy provided for new builds. And that is the most advanced form of policy support from the Korean government, and I don't think that is enough. For bulkers, if the shippers do not give them orders, they cannot do business. But so we need to make sure that these cargo owners, the shippers, have an incentive to place orders with eco-friendly ships. And when that is done, we need to provide them with sufficient incentives. Other than that, these shippers will not place 10-year and 20-year orders, and then the bulk carriers will have no reason to adopt eco-friendly ships. Rather than just leaving everything up to the IMO, for the IMO regulations to actually take effect, there are many pieces of the puzzle that we need to put together, and I ask for the government to be more proactive on that. Thank you very much, Mr. Chen.
Good morning. I'm with the Port Logistics Division, and Mr. Oh couldn't make it today. My apologies. Well, of course, there are many things I can talk about, but I am responsible for container. Pierce Logistics. And when it comes to smart shipping, well, 6 ports have fully automatic ports, and Korea is going to be the 7th country to introduce such an automatic port. So it is an advanced nation, but in order to catch up with our competitors, we will do our best so that we can automate Jinhae port as well. And when it comes to port management, we have this transformation of facilities and equipment. So yard tractors, we're done with that. And with LNG, hydrogen and electricity, we have to move towards net zero. So when it comes to policies, we do have some challenges, but we'll do our best. Thank you. Thank you very much. So my questions were addressed by Professor Wu. So Mr. Jin doesn't need to address that further. Maybe we can take one question from the floor.
특별히
Oh, it seems like we don't have any questions. Thank you very much for your participation throughout the session. We looked at the cases of the UK and the US, and they joined us at 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. in each nation. And I'd like to thank you. Big hand to Professor Tristan Smith. Thank you. Thank you once again for your participation. So with this, we had the theme of the current status and future development of shipping and ports logistics in the transitional era. That was the shipping and port session. Thank you very much for your presentations and your discussions. I'd like to thank all the participants, and with that, I'd like to conclude the session. Thank you. Thank you once again for the discussions, and big thank you to the panelists and presenters. We will take a group photo, so please stay on the stage.
네, 고생 정말 많.
Thank you for your presence. This concludes our shipping and port session. And I'd like to thank Professor Tristan Smith and Commissioner Sam Jo for joining us online. We will resume at 1:30 with the title Home Port Strategy for K-Cruise. Thank you.